Hey, U.S. history students, as promised, we are going to spend some time reviewing for your upcoming Great Depression and New Deal test together. So if you've got your study guide, I hope you get that out and follow along in this quick video where we're going to cover a lot of the topics that we did not have time to spend time properly reviewing in class. So follow along with me and we will see if we can prepare for the upcoming test. So hopefully you've got your study guide with you. You notice, as always, I tell you, this is not an exhaustive list. I will not promise you that every single thing on this study guide is on the test or that every topic on the test is covered on the study guide. So the best thing you can do is make sure you've completed all assigned readings. So refer to the Unit 7 guide for the pages in your textbook. Make sure you do that. Make sure you look over any guided readings I've given you. And of course, your in-class notes. But let's run through a few of these real quick. Key terms, these are generally people that you need to know definitions. Why were these people important? Or these topics, why were they important? So let's run through a few really quickly. Mary McLeod Bethune is an example of an African-American leader who was part of the Roosevelt administration. She worked in the National Youth Association. This is an example of the diverse group of people that the Roosevelt administration brought into government that not only obviously brought a lot of expertise, but also helped build that New Deal coalition. Frances Perkins is another such example. Frances Perkins is the first female member of a presidential cabinet. She was the Secretary of Labor. Some other important people you ought to know, John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck is an author, known for many books, most notably The Grapes of Wrath. He is a beneficiary of the Federal Writers Project, part of the WPA. What was he writing about? He was writing about life in the Dust Bowl out west. The Dust Bowl. Remember, the Dust Bowl is this period of time from North Texas up through Oklahoma that where the sky turned black during the Great Depression because of drought, because of over farming. Massive dust storms only added to the misery, and in fact caused many people to abandon their farming in the Midwest and move out to California. A few other terms you ought to know of her. Hooverville. Remember, Herbert Hoover was the president at the time that the Great Depression began. He did not cause it, but he's there. And people had the perception he wasn't doing anything to help. And so his name becomes a symbol of presidential failure. So Hoovervilles are shanty towns. People who had lost their homes or were living in the streets in these cardboard boxes and stuff, those are Hoovervilles. And those cardboard boxes, those shanties, are Hoover hotels. Black Tuesday is what a lot of people point to as the beginning of the Great Depression. Well, it's far more complicated than that. You know, the Black Tuesday in October of 1929 is the day that the stock market crashed. Stock market crashed. And a lot of people look at that as the beginning of the Great Depression. But of course, depending on who you were, the Depression may have started earlier. In the roaring 20s, a lot of people thought, man, things are great. The economy is great. That's not true if you're a farmer. For farmers, particularly in the West, Midwest, the Great Depression started years earlier. Why? Because as we've talked about, going all the way back to the populist movement, they were producing a lot, lots of production of crops, but that unfortunately is leading to lower and lower and lower prices, so that farmers are working very hard, but they cannot make any money. That's why down the road, when we talk about the New Deal, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, is going to pay farmers not to farm. Why? Because it's hoping that that will help to restore farm prices so the things they do produce, they can make money. Let's run through a few here. Describe Herbert Hoover's political ideology. Herbert Hoover is an incredible businessman. So many things we talked about in class that he was successful at. However, he is your typical 1920s president, and he believes in hands-off in terms of the economy, laissez-faire. It's best, he believed, as many did, that if there's an economic downturn, the government shouldn't do very much because they could only make it worse. As the Depression got worse, many Americans looked to Hoover to do more, and he did take some steps. Voluntarism, trying to encourage people to voluntarily keep wages high and those sort of stuff. Some public works. The Hoover Dam, for example, is something that's built, but not very aggressive, not aggressive enough that at least the voters in 1932 felt it. And that's why Franklin Roosevelt is going to win in a landslide in 1932, promising direct help to people. A good example of Hoover's missteps would be the Bonus Army. Remember the Bonus Army? Are veterans from World War I who had been promised a bonus for their service to the country by Congress when the Depression hit. That bonus was not supposed to kick in until many years later, but they are desperate. It is a depression. They march to Washington to ask for early payment of the bonus, and Hoover orders them to be removed, and the army overstepped their orders probably and ran them out of town and burned their possessions. Another example of the missteps of the Hoover administration, giving the impression to many voters that he didn't care. Describe the experience of African Americans and other minority groups. As is often the case, when there's an economic downturn, those people who are on the margins of society suffer the worst. The Depression was bad for everyone, but for African Americans in the South, for people living in the slums of the cities, it's even worse than before. It's even worse than before. And that is why when the New Deal comes along under Roosevelt, and many of the benefits of the New Deal go on to benefit some of those marginalized communities, that they are going to be supportive of the New Deal, and they're going to be supported of the Democratic Party. This is the so-called New Deal coalition, the most important of which are African Americans. African Americans to this point had overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party. That is going to change. They're going to break away from the Republican Party and move to the Democratic Party as part of the New Deal coalition. Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt's characteristics and qualities as governor, as we said, governor of New York, direct aid to people. But he's also incredibly optimistic. He's a salesman. He knows how to use mass media. We talked about the fireside chats. Fireside chats are examples of time when Roosevelt would use the radio to come into people's homes and explain his policies. And he had a gift for this, a gift to convince people to support some of his policies. Eleanor Roosevelt is the most active first lady we've ever had in history. She gets starts in settlement houses and those sort of things, but she's very much the eyes and ears of the New Deal. She's the one who goes out and sees what's going on in the country and brings it back to the president. The New Deal is the all the programs that were designed to fight the Great Depression. They're divided into 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for the unemployed, recovery of business, and reform to make sure that these things don't happen again. These things don't happen again. Most of the New Deal legislation is passed in 100 days. The 100 days is that first roughly 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, which is a tremendous amount of legislation is passed, the vast majority of the New Deal. But the single most important issue, of course, is the banks. Banks are failing left and right. And you know from our time in class, what happened if people put money in the bank and then the bank closed? Well, they lost all their money. And that leads to fear and people running on banks. A bank run is when people run to the bank and withdraw all their money, therefore making the problem worse. And sometimes having a healthy bank go under. So the banking crisis is the #1 issue that Roosevelt had to address. And that is the first thing he's going to do with the banking holiday. We have listed here a lot of the New Deal programs, Civilian Conservation Corps, where young men were put to work planting trees and making reservoirs and those sorts of things. We've already talked about the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Securities and Exchange Commission is there to regulate or police the Wall Street, the stock market, to make sure they behave. The Glass-Steagall Act had to do with regulating banking. These are reforms, right? We're trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. So let's address the problems that existed that allowed it. The Glass-Steagall Act, probably what it's most well known for, is creating the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which means that if you put your money in the bank and the bank goes under, it is insured because it's a member, FDIC. Wagner Act has to do with organized labor unions, allowing for collective bargaining, strengthening unions. Again, this is a new example of why certain people are members of the New Deal coalition, the groups of voters who benefited from the New Deal and therefore are loyal to the Democratic Party for decades. We talked about African-American voters earlier. Wagner Act, this is union workers again. Not everyone liked the New Deal, obviously, and it's important to point that out. The American Liberty League is formed to oppose the New Deal. These are more conservative people who were concerned about the growth of government power and the growth of regulation. The New Deal is a stark difference than anything that had happened in the 1920s. Huey Long is an attack from the left, saying the New Deal does not go far enough. Huey Long, with his Share Our Wealth Society, sharing the wealth of the rich with those who are less fortunate, said the New Deal ought to be doing more to help people. And a lot of folks thought Huey Long probably would have run for president one day. He doesn't get the chance because sadly he's assassinated. But so here we have an example of the American Liberty League, an attack from the right, Huey Long, an attack from the left. Father Charles Coughlin is another critic of the New Deal. He's probably more well remembered from using his radio platform to promote anti-Semitism and fascism and lots of other very unfortunate and dangerous ideologies. Francis Townsend comes up with a plan, the Townsend Plan. Remember, this is the one we talked about, paying elderly people not to work, to retire. People didn't have retirement back in those days. And even if they did, if it was in the bank, they probably lost all of it. And so Townsend says one way to free up jobs for unemployed younger people is to make sure that older people can afford to retire. The Townsend Plan does not become the law, but it does perhaps lead to discussions about creating some sort of pension retirement plan. And we see that ultimately with the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act is Roosevelt's plan to help retirees. It still exists today. It's still rather popular today. As always, as I've always said, and I shall say again and again and again, I don't know why presidents serve 2 terms. Every single president, it seems, has a rough second term when compared to their first, and President Roosevelt is no different. We see this with the court packing scheme. He wanted to add new justices to the court. Why? Because they were not being friendly. The Supreme Court was not being friendly to New Deal legislation. If he could pack the court, if he could get Congress to change it so he could appoint a bunch of new justices, then maybe they would be friendlier toward his New Deal legislation. This does not happen. This does not happen. In fact, it is a political misstep by President Roosevelt because it threatened to interfere with the separation of powers, right? The president is the executive branch and the Supreme Court is the judicial branch. And while presidents can appoint a Supreme Court justice anytime there's a vacancy, the idea that he would try to completely manipulate the court so it's friendly to him looks pretty bad and causes him a lot of support, particularly with more conservative to moderate Democrats. And then, of course, there's the recession, the Roosevelt recession in 1937 by 1938. That's brought on because many of the New Deal programs were being cut back, that a lot of these temporary programs that were designed to alleviate suffering, a lot of money is being pumped into the economy. When that money is taken away, when the government cuts spending, the economy takes a downturn. And so apparently the economy is not as healthy as they had hoped, right? That the New Deal was helping people. The New Deal is putting people to work. The New Deal is building dams and schools, and it's doing a lot. But the economy still had problems, and that can be seen by the fact that once government spending was cut, things get worse again. It's a depressing time of the 1930s, and that's why escapist entertainment, movies and radio that were out of this world, were fanciful, were very popular today. Some of those escapist entertainment had to do with promoting wholesome values and people who are down on the luck, Frank Capra films, this sort of stuff, but also animation, right? It's in the 1930s we get the first feature-length animated film with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That's not reality-based, that's escapist. The Wizard of Oz, 1939, is the first film, live-action film to have color. And of course, radio is massive at the time too, but again, we're sticking with escapist entertainment. We've got things like The Lone Ranger is a popular radio show. War of the Worlds, that was a broadcast of a book that made it seem as if aliens were invading, right? Radio and movies are actually kind of in a golden age because it's cheap entertainment and no one has very much money, and it's escapist entertainment. People want something to brighten their time. All right. So there's lots more there. That is not everything, certainly, that you need to know. You need to make sure you have completed your reading. You need to make sure you have reviewed your notes that we've taken in class and any sort of guided reading that you might have had. But hopefully, if you filled that out as we go through that, hopefully that was helpful to you. Turn in your study guide, take the test, do great. Best of luck.